The common explanation is that privacy during sex is about modesty, or shame, or morality. Fossil evidence and primate research suggests something colder. It may have evolved as a tool for figuring out who a child's father actually was. That single sentence is where this entire investigation begins, because the moment it's said out loud, a much stranger question follows right behind it. If privacy were really about morality, it should show up unevenly across the world. Some cultures modest, some cultures loose, some cultures somewhere in between, exactly the way clothing styles or table manners vary by region and by era. But that is not what the data actually shows. In 2020, an anthropologist at the University of Zurich sat down with a number that should stop anyone in their tracks. 4,572. That is how many ethnographic accounts he pulled from the historical and anthropological record, spanning cultures on every inhabited continent, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years of independent development, with no contact with one another at all. And in that entire dataset, one behavior showed up again and again with almost no exceptions: concealment during sex. Not universal in the sense that every single culture practiced it identically. Some had elaborate private chambers, some slipped into the bush, some waited for darkness and silence, but universal in the sense that some form of active concealment appeared almost everywhere humans have ever been studied. That is not what a merely cultural habit looks like. That is what a biological instinct looks like, one wearing 1,000 different cultural costumes. For most of the animal kingdom, mating in the open is not a risk. It is standard procedure. Lions mate in full view of the pride. Deer mate on open ground. Birds mate on branches in broad daylight with other birds watching from 3 feet away, and nobody seems to mind. Sex, across most of the animal kingdom, is not something that requires walls, or darkness, or a lookout. It requires proximity and readiness. So, why did one species, a mid-sized, hairless primate walking upright across the plains of Africa, apparently decide at some point in its evolutionary history that this single, universal, unremarkable animal behavior needed to be hidden? This video traces that question through primate behavior at Kyoto University's long-running bonobo research site in the Democratic Republic of Congo, through decades of chimpanzee fieldwork on subordinate males mating in secret, through the 1981 fieldwork of an Emory University anthropologist living among the Kalahari's Jew Hawansi people, through the biology of concealed ovulation first proposed by researchers in 1979, and finally through that 2020 study out of Zurich that connects all of it to a small, temperamental desert bird. By the end, the obvious explanation, shame, modesty, decency, will not survive contact with the evidence. What will be left standing instead is a theory that has almost nothing to do with morality, and almost everything to do with a much older, much colder problem, knowing, with any confidence at all, whose child is whose. Start with what almost never happens in the wild. Chimpanzees, the species that shares roughly 98% of its DNA with humans, do not hide when they mate. When a female chimpanzee reaches peak fertility, the skin around her genitals swells and turns a vivid pink, an advertisement, essentially, broadcast to every male in the group simultaneously. There is no ambiguity, no secrecy, no discretion involved. A 2013 report on primate mating behavior, drawing on observations from researchers studying wild chimpanzee communities, describes the female approach as blunt to the point of comedy. If she is interested in a particular male, she does not wait to be noticed. She backs her swollen hindquarters directly into his field of vision. The male's response is equally unsubtle: a shaken branch, a display of arousal, sometimes nothing more than eye contact held a beat too long. Mating happens where it happens, in front of the group, in front of the juveniles, in front of every rival male in the community. But there is one specific wrinkle buried inside that same body of chimpanzee research, and it is the wrinkle this whole investigation hinges on. Primatologist Darby Proctor, who studies primate behavior at Emory University, has described a very particular pattern among lower-ranking males in a chimpanzee troop. When a subordinate male gets an opportunity to mate with a female the alpha male has not claimed, he does not always do it in the open. Sometimes, according to Proctor's observations, he does it in secret, slipping off to the edge of the group, out of the alpha's direct line of sight, and if the alpha does discover the pair mid-act, the consequence is not a shrug. It is what researchers call a bluff display, a full-speed charge, teeth bared, designed to terrify. So the mating itself is not secret because sex is shameful to a chimpanzee. It is secret because getting caught by the wrong male at the wrong moment in front of the wrong audience has a cost, a very physical, very immediate cost. Hold on to that thread because it is about to become the spine of the entire theory. Now walk 70 kilometers deeper into the Congo Basin to a research site called Wamba, where in 1973 a young Japanese primatologist named Takayoshi Kano began an entirely different kind of observation, not of common chimpanzees, but of their close cousin, the bonobo. What Kano documented at Wamba, according to later accounts from Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham, upended a basic assumption biologists had been carrying for decades. Kano expected, reasonably, that bonobo society would mirror chimpanzee society, males dominant, females subordinate, mating controlled by rank and force. Instead, he found something almost unrecognizable. Female bonobos sat at the center of the group. When a male charged aggressively toward a cluster of females, Kano told a Smithsonian Magazine reporter decades later, the females did not scatter. They either ignored him completely or drove him off into the trees. Wrangham's blunt summary of ordinary chimpanzee hierarchy, that every female of every rank is subordinate to every male of every rank, simply does not apply to bonobos at all. And bonobo sex, correspondingly, does not look like chimpanzee sex. Field data compiled from Wamba shows bonobos adopting a face-to-face copulation position in roughly 1 out of every 3 matings, a behavior that is almost never observed in common chimpanzees. It happens constantly, casually, in mixed company, between males and females, between 2 females, sometimes used to diffuse tension after a dispute over food rather than for reproduction at all. Bonobos are, by any reasonable definition, the least secretive great ape when it comes to sex. There is no hiding. Because in bonobo society, there is almost nothing to hide from. Reproductive success is spread more evenly. Female alliances blunt male aggression before it escalates. The stakes of being watched are simply lower. So now there are 2 data points sitting side by side, and they already start sketching the outline of an answer. Chimpanzees, high male aggression, steep rank hierarchy, and, specifically among lower-ranked males, avoiding a dominant rival, occasional secrecy. Bonobos, low male aggression, flattened hierarchy, and essentially no secrecy at all. The presence or absence of hiding does not track with intelligence, or with brain size, or with any kind of moral sophistication. It tracks with risk. Specifically, the risk of being seen by someone whose response could cost the mating pair something real. Which raises the obvious next question. What exactly was early human society risking? This is where the picture shifts from ape behavior to the fossil and skeletal record. And it starts with a body part hardly anyone thinks about in this context, the teeth. In 2009, a team of researchers including Jen Suwa, Reiko Kono, Scott Simpson, Burhane Asfaw, Tim White, and paleoanthropologist Owen Lovejoy published detailed findings on Ardipithecus ramidus in the journal Science. Based on skeletal remains dated to roughly 4 million years old, unearthed in the Afar region of Ethiopia. One of the most striking findings involved the canine teeth. In most primates, chimpanzees very much included, males carry large, dagger-like canines sharpened by friction against the lower teeth, functioning essentially as built-in weapons for male-on-male combat over access to females. In Ardipithecus, the team's statistical analysis of the fossil dataset found canine size dimorphism between males and females that was already lower than in bonobos, the modern ape with the least dimorphic canines on record, and comparable to levels seen in living humans at a species dated 4 million years back. Lovejoy connected that reduction to a larger, more sweeping proposal, a marked decline in the intensity of direct male-to-male violence over mating access, paired with males walking upright specifically to free their hands for carrying provisions back to a single mate and her offspring. Bipedalism, in this reading, evolved partly as a delivery system for a pair bonding strategy. But this is exactly the point in the story where the evidence stops being tidy, and it's worth saying so directly rather than smoothing it over. Lovejoy's interpretation has been publicly and specifically challenged. Paleoanthropologist John Hawkes has pointed out that bonobos, despite showing similarly reduced canine dimorphism, do not practice pair-bonded monogamy at all. as already established from the Wamba fieldwork, which undercuts the assumption that small canines automatically signal a pair-bonded mating system. If reduced canines can arise from an entirely different social structure, canine size alone cannot carry the full weight of Lovejoy's argument. That gap in the fossil case has never been fully closed, and it means the Ardipithecus evidence should be treated as suggestive of reduced male-on-male aggression specifically, rather than airtight proof of pair bonding on its own. What survives the disagreement, and what both sides of the debate largely accept, is the narrower claim, something about the intensity of direct physical competition between hominin males had measurably eased by 4 million years ago, regardless of exactly which social system replaced it. In plain terms, somewhere in the deep past, the ancestors of modern humans appear to have partially stepped off the chimpanzee model of settling reproductive competition with brute physical force and moved towards something that looked more like ongoing, paired relationships. Anthropologists call this pattern pair bonding, and it created an entirely new problem that chimpanzees, with their more openly contested and force-driven mating system, never really had to solve in the same way. So what's actually at stake here, biologically, if a male gets paternity wrong? This is worth pausing on directly, because the cost is not abstract. Human infants are, by the standards of the rest of the animal kingdom, an extraordinary drain on resources for an extraordinary length of time. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur and travel independently within months. A human infant cannot support its own head for weeks, cannot walk for roughly a year, and remains functionally dependent on adult provisioning for the better part of a decade. A direct consequence, according to researchers studying the trade-off between brain size and pelvic anatomy, of a skull that has to fit through a bipedal pelvis while still housing a brain built for the eventual cognitive demands of adult human life. That mismatch forces human babies to be born earlier, relatively speaking, and finish an enormous amount of brain development outside the womb, under the direct care of adults, for years on end. A male hominin investing food, protection, and years of provisioning into a child that turns out not to be genetically his is not making a small miscalculation. He is pouring an entire reproductive strategy's worth of resources into propagating a rival's genes instead of his own, which, in the cold arithmetic of natural selection, is close to the single worst possible outcome available to him. That is the exact scale of the problem concealed ovulation would eventually be recruited to help manage. Here is the problem, laid out plainly. In a species where dominant males can physically guard access to females around the clock, the way a high-ranking chimpanzee might attempt to do, there is at least some crude confidence about paternity, enforced through raw proximity and threat. But once early hominins began living in longer-term pairs, spread across a social landscape with other adults nearby, near constant physical guarding became impossible. A male could not follow a female every waking hour of every day without abandoning the hunting, scavenging, and resource gathering that pair bonding was supposedly designed to support in the first place. And that gap, the gap between wanting certainty and being physically unable to enforce it, is precisely where an evolutionary theory called concealed ovulation enters the story. Here is a fact that surprises most people the first time they hear it stated plainly: human females do not visibly advertise ovulation. There is no swelling, no color change, no scent-driven signal broadcast to the surrounding group the way there is in chimpanzees and many other primates. Compared to the unmistakable pink display of an ovulating chimpanzee, the moment of peak human fertility is, to any outside observer, including the woman's own partner, functionally invisible. In 1979, researchers Richard Alexander and Catherine Noonan proposed an explanation for why that invisibility might have evolved, one that has been debated, refined, and argued over ever since. If a male cannot pinpoint exactly when a female is fertile, the theory goes, his best reproductive strategy shifts. Rather than searching for a brief fertile window and guarding it obsessively, the way many primates effectively do, he is instead pushed toward staying close and mating repeatedly across the entire cycle, because any given encounter might be the one that matters. So what's actually happening at the level of individual behavior, generation after generation? Anthropologist Beverly Strassman, examining this same question in a 1981 paper on sexual selection and paternal care, laid out the underlying cost calculation with unusual precision. Continuous mate guarding, a male physically shadowing a female around the clock to ensure paternity, carries a real, Measurable cost. Every hour spent guarding is an hour not spent hunting, scavenging, or gathering. Activities that were, by the pair bonding model's own logic, the entire reason the arrangement was supposed to be worthwhile in the first place. Concealed ovulation, in Strassman's framing, offers a cheaper alternative. Instead of guarding a known fertile window at high cost, a male can maintain reasonably high paternity confidence more efficiently simply by staying near one partner and mating regularly, without ever needing to identify the exact biological moment that matters most. Evolutionary biologist Jared Diamond, in his book Why is Sex Fun?, later summarized the competing versions of this idea under two blunt labels that have stuck in the literature ever since. The daddy-at-home theory, which holds that concealed ovulation evolved specifically to keep a male present, engaged, and reasonably confident in his own paternity, and the rival many fathers theory, which flips the logic entirely, proposing that concealment instead gave females more room to quietly mate outside the pair bond, while keeping multiple males each uncertain enough about paternity that none of them had a clear reason for aggression. Those two theories disagree about almost everything: who benefits, whose interests are actually being served, whether monogamy or its opposite is the real evolutionary payoff. But notice what they do not disagree about. Both are built entirely around the same central currency: information about paternity, and who does or doesn't get access to it. So what's actually going on here becomes a little clearer with each layer. Chimpanzees solve the paternity problem through physical dominance and force. Bonobos mostly sidestep the problem because their social structure diffuses aggression before it escalates. And the ancestors of modern humans, walking away from constant violent guarding toward pair bonding, appear to have stumbled onto biological concealment instead, hiding the fertile window itself from view. But concealed ovulation only solves half of the puzzle. It hides when conception is happening. It does not automatically hide the fact that mating is happening at all. And that gap, the gap between concealing fertility and concealing the act itself, is exactly the gap the 2020 University of Zurich study was built to investigate. Now, here's the disturbing part, or at least the part that reframes everything discussed so far. The researcher behind that 2020 study, anthropologist Yitzchak Ben-Mocha, did not begin with humans at all. He began with a bird. Specifically, the Arabian babbler, a small, highly social desert bird studied for decades in Israel's Negev desert, living in tight cooperative groups of up to 20 individuals with a clear, rigidly enforced internal pecking order, one that governs everything from feeding position to who gets to breed at all. In most babbler groups, only the dominant pair is expected to reproduce. Subordinate members typically help raise the dominant pair's offspring rather than producing their own. Given that steep hierarchy, the obvious prediction is straightforward: subordinate babblers, with everything to lose and a dominant pair willing to enforce the rules aggressively, should be the ones sneaking off to mate out of sight, while the dominant pair, with nothing to fear and full social permission to breed openly, should have no reason to hide at all. Ben-Mocha, working from Zurich, had spent time observing these groups directly, and what he found broke that prediction cleanly in half. Even the dominant birds in a babbler group, the ones with nothing obvious to fear, no rival capable of overpowering them, full social sanction to mate whenever they chose, would still actively seek concealment before mating, moving off into dense cover before copulating even when no immediate threat was anywhere nearby. That detail did not fit any simple story about avoiding punishment. If concealment were purely about a weaker individual avoiding a stronger rival's wrath, the strongest pair in the entire group, immune to that particular danger, should have had no reason to bother hiding at all. And yet they did, every time. That single behavioral puzzle sent him back through the anthropological record, hunting for a pattern across human cultures broad enough to test whether the same logic might apply to people. That is where the 4,572 ethnographic accounts came from, a systematic sweep filtered carefully to exclude anything driven by taboo, legal punishment, or performance, isolating only what people across radically different cultures considered their ordinary, unremarkable sexual behavior. Now here's a detail worth sitting with. Ben-Mocha specifically excluded cases involving incest, where concealment might simply reflect fear of punishment rather than anything deeper, and he excluded public sex acts tied to specific festivals or ritual contexts, where display rather than concealment was the entire point. He was not hunting for exceptions or edge cases. He was isolating the behavioral default, what people did on an ordinary night, in an ordinary context, with no taboo and no ceremony involved at all. And the pattern held. held. Virtually every culture in the dataset showed some form of active concealment, even in circumstances where privacy was expensive, difficult, or nearly impossible to arrange, exactly the situation documented among the Juhuanzi. Ben-Mocha then searched the broader animal behavior literature for any other species exhibiting the same pattern and came up almost empty. Among everything examined, hiding during mating turned out to be documented in exactly 2 species on the entire list: humans and the Arabian babbler, 2 species, out of the enormous, richly studied span of the animal kingdom. 2. Ben-Mocha's conclusion, published in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B, was not built around modesty or morality at all. His proposal centered on something closer to jealousy management and mate guarding by proxy. If a male's mate is seen by other males in a state of sexual arousal, he argued, that visibility itself can function as a kind of signal, an invitation, intentional or not, for those other males to consider pursuing her. Concealing the act in this framing is not about hiding an embarrassing behavior. It is about controlling who gets access to a specific piece of information, the knowledge that a mating opportunity currently exists at all. Deny outside males that information, and the competitive pressure it would otherwise generate simply never has the chance to build. Put that alongside the concealed ovulation research, and something clicks into place that neither piece explains fully on its own. Concealed ovulation hides when. Concealed mating hides that. Together, they form something closer to a complete information control system, operating at 2 different layers simultaneously, both aimed at the exact same underlying target, protecting a pair bond's reproductive certainty in a social environment that, unlike a solitary predator's territory, is absolutely packed with other watching, competing adults. But there is a serious complication buried inside this theory, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than smoothed over. Because a good theory has to survive its own best objection. Critics of Ben-Mocha's framing have pointed out something that sounds almost too obvious once it's stated. Other highly social primates, including chimpanzees living in dense, competitive, hierarchical groups, do not practice anything close to universal concealment the way humans do. Only certain subordinate males. In certain specific circumstances, avoiding certain specific rivals. If avoiding jealousy and mate theft were the whole explanation, on its own, it is not obvious why humans crossed a behavioral threshold that other highly social, highly competitive primates never fully crossed. That gap in the argument has not been fully closed by any single study, including this one. And it's worth sitting with that honestly, rather than pretending the science has arrived at a tidy, unanimous conclusion. What most researchers in this specific area do agree on is narrower, but still striking. Whatever the deeper mechanism turns out to be, morality and modesty are almost certainly downstream effects layered on top of something older, not the original cause. Cultures did not invent an arbitrary taboo and then, coincidentally, land on the exact same taboo independently, thousands of times, across every isolated pocket of the globe. Something underneath the taboo was already pulling in the same direction before any specific culture's moral code ever got involved. So what did that pulling actually look like on the ground? Inside a real hunter-gatherer community, before agriculture, before private bedrooms, before doors that lock? In 1969, an anthropologist named Marjorie Shostak, based at Emory University, traveled to the Dobi region of northwestern Botswana, at the edge of the Kalahari Desert, to live among the Juhuanzi people, often referred to in the anthropological literature by the older term Kung San. Over roughly 2 years of fieldwork, she built a close relationship with a woman she referred to by the pseudonym Nisa, and the resulting book Nisa, The Life and Words of A. Kung Woman, published by Harvard University Press in 1981, remains one of the most detailed first-hand ethnographic accounts of hunter-gatherer sexuality ever recorded. What Shostak documented was a community with essentially none of the physical infrastructure modern audiences would associate with sexual privacy. No separate bedrooms, no hallways, no doors, no walls thick enough to muffle sound. Families slept together inside a single small hut, parents and children under the same blankets, in the same enclosed space, night after night. And according to Shostak's account, this arrangement created exactly the problem it sounds like it would create. Children became aware, at a fairly young age, of what their parents were doing under those blankets after dark. Nisa herself, recalling her own childhood in the interviews compiled for the book, described the moment she first understood what was happening. And her reaction was not curiosity. It was discomfort sharp enough that she got up and moved to sleep in a different hut entirely. That single detail matters more than it first appears to, because it shows privacy functioning as an active behavior under genuine physical constraint, not a comfortable given. The Jew Hwansi had no walls to rely on, so the culture built a workaround instead. According to the ethnographic record Showstock compiled, couples would slip away into the surrounding bush during the day, or wait deliberately until children in the shared hut had fallen fully asleep at night, actively timing and relocating their intimacy around the presence of an audience they could not otherwise remove. And as children moved into adolescence, the record shows an even more explicit cultural solution. Teenagers were commonly given their own separate sleeping huts, built specifically to grant their parents a version of privacy the shared family hut could no longer provide once the children were old enough to fully understand what they were witnessing. This is not modesty in the sense of an arbitrary social rule copied down from one generation to the next without a reason attached, the way a specific fashion trend might spread. This is architecture and scheduling, built from nothing by a community with no exposure to any Victorian-style modesty code, no organized religion dictating rules of decency, no written law of any kind, solving the exact same underlying problem that a subordinate chimpanzee slipping away from an alpha male's line of sight was also, in its own much cruder way, solving. Reduce the audience. Reduce the information leaking out to that audience. Reduce whatever consequence that information might otherwise trigger. But listen to this. Because the story does not stop at hunter-gatherer societies without walls. It carries forward in a more or less unbroken line into the very homes modern audiences grew up inside. Sociologist Norbert Elias, in his 1939 study The History of Manners, the opening volume of a larger work titled The Civilizing Process, traced how European ideas about a private bedroom actually developed. And the timeline he laid out is a great deal shorter than most people assume. For most of the medieval period across Europe, there was no such thing as a bedroom in the modern sense at all. Entire households, parents, children, servants, sometimes livestock brought in against the cold, slept together in a single multi-purpose hall, the same room used for eating, working, and receiving guests during the day. According to historical accounts of English Tudor households, even the wealthiest families typically had only a curtain, not a wall, separating the master's bed from the rest of the room's daily activity, meaning couples wanting any degree of privacy for sex often had to wait until the middle of the night, after the household had gone fully quiet. And even then, a thin curtain was the entire barrier standing between them and everyone else in the hall. Historian A. Roger Ekirk's research into pre-industrial sleeping habits describes a world where privacy of any kind was, in his own phrase, in short supply. People ate, slept, and attended to nearly all personal matters within sight of family members, servants, and often farm animals as well, with private moments snatched wherever and whenever the household's rhythm briefly allowed it. It was not until the 17th century, according to design historians tracing the development of domestic architecture, that a genuinely new architectural feature appeared in wealthy European households, a small side room attached to the main bedchamber, known in the French tradition as a closet. Not a place for storing clothing in the modern sense, but a private, lockable space belonging to a single individual, used specifically to get away from everyone else. That innovation filtered slowly downward through the social classes over roughly 2 centuries. It was only in the 19th century, under Victorian social reformers actively campaigning against communal sleeping on both moral and public health grounds simultaneously, that individually assigned bedrooms, one per person, one door, one lock, finally became the default expectation across the broader middle class, rather than a luxury reserved for nobility. Set that single fact directly beside everything else gathered so far in this investigation, and the parallel becomes hard to miss. European households spent centuries without private bedrooms for the overwhelming majority of the population, and across every one of those centuries, according to the historical record, couples were still actively finding ways to carve moments of concealment out of an environment that offered almost none. Waiting for darkness, waiting for the room to go quiet, making do with a curtain instead of a wall. That is architecturally, almost beat for beat, the identical workaround Marjorie Showstock documented among the Jew Hwansi living in the Kalahari with no walls at all. 2 societies, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, with radically different technology, radically different economies, and radically different belief systems. independently arriving at the same fallback solution the moment architecture failed to provide it directly. Timing, not walls, becomes the tool when walls are not yet available. The modern locked bedroom door did not create the underlying urge toward concealment. It only finally gave that already existing urge somewhere convenient to live, which leads directly into the elimination process. This whole investigation has actually been running underneath the surface the entire time, because there were other, more obvious explanations sitting right there, and each one needs to be tested and ruled out on its own terms before the paternity and information theory can be taken seriously as the strongest remaining answer. Rule out religion first, since it's the most commonly assumed cause by default. Concealment during sex, according to Ben-Mocha's cross-cultural dataset, appears in cultures with no shared religious tradition whatsoever, hunter-gatherer societies with animist belief systems entirely unconnected to the Abrahamic traditions that produced Western ideas of sexual shame, alongside cultures with elaborate organized religions, alongside cultures that predate any of the world's major religions by tens of thousands of years. If organized religion were the actual cause, the behavior should track religious contact and religious conversion. It does not. It appears to have been there already, waiting, before any specific religious framework arrived to explain it after the fact. Rule out formal written law next. Nisas. Kung community, and the vast majority of hunter-gatherer societies represented across that same 4,572 account dataset had no written legal codes governing sexual conduct at all. No statutes, no formalized punishments, no courts. Concealment still showed up as the default behavior anyway, independent of any legal framework designed to enforce it. Rule out simple physical comfort or convenience as well, since it's a tempting shortcut explanation. If concealment were only about physical comfort, softer ground, better shelter from weather, a more comfortable surface than open dirt, it would not need to specifically exclude observers. Comfort and secrecy are two entirely separate variables, and cultures across the world clearly optimized for both independently and separately. The Jew Hawansi timing their encounters around a sleeping child, specifically, is not a comfort adaptation. Comfort would only care about ground texture and weather. This is an information adaptation, aimed squarely and only at controlling who gets to see and know. Rule out simple predator avoidance too, since it's the explanation that would seem to apply most directly to early hominins on an open savanna. It is true that any exposed, distracted moment carries some baseline predator risk on the African plains. But predator risk does not explain why concealment specifically targets other members of one's own social group rather than the surrounding landscape generally. A couple slipping into the bush at a Jew Hawansi camp is not moving toward greater safety from lions. If anything, stepping outside the ring of firelight and the protection of numbers increases that particular risk. What they are moving away from is not a predator, it is an audience. That single distinction, safety from predators versus concealment from conspecifics, is precisely the distinction predator avoidance cannot explain, and precisely the distinction the paternity and information theory was built to explain from the outset. What's left, once religion, law, physical comfort, and predator avoidance have each been eliminated in turn, is something closer to the theory this entire script has been slowly building toward. Not shame in the modern, moralized sense of the word at all. Something far older and far more mechanical, an instinct for controlling reproductive information, running quietly in the evolutionary background long before any culture on Earth had the vocabulary, the religious framework, or even the concept necessary to call it modesty. Here's the disturbing part, layered one level deeper this time. If that theory holds up, then the entire modern architecture of privacy, the locked bedroom door, the drawn curtain, the whispered late-night conversation, is not a symbol of romantic intimacy in the way it tends to get framed today. It is closer to a fossil, a behavior originally selected for because it once had a measurable, tangible effect on which specific genes made it into the next generation, still running in the present day for reasons that have almost nothing to do with the emotional, romantic vocabulary now layered thickly on top of it. Consider for a moment how strange that actually is when it's stated plainly and without the usual softening language. A behavior currently understood by most people, most of the time, in terms of intimacy, comfort, and romantic connection. Three concepts that feel modern, personal, deeply human in the emotionally loaded sense of that word, may in fact trace back to a colder, far more transactional problem involving paternity confidence and reproductive competition among distant ancestors who never once thought about romance in anything resembling the way it gets thought about now. The feeling attached to the behavior changed completely across deep evolutionary time. The underlying behavior itself, according to this body of research, may not have changed nearly as much. Now, here's a question worth sitting with directly. Does knowing the possible evolutionary explanation for privacy change how the behavior itself actually feels in the moment to the people practicing it today? Almost certainly not. And that gap is worth noticing rather than glossing over. Evolutionary explanations describe why a behavior may have originally been favored by selection pressure operating across countless generations. They do not describe, and were never designed to describe, what that behavior consciously means to the specific individual doing it in the present moment, with none of that deep evolutionary history in mind at all. A modern couple closing a bedroom door is not thinking about babbler research from the Negev Desert, or fossilized canine teeth from Ethiopia, or Ben-Mocha's dataset of ethnographic accounts. They are, almost certainly, thinking about comfort, intimacy, and connection. Full stop. Both explanations can be entirely true at exactly the same time, sitting on two completely different levels of description. One operates on the level of felt, personal, conscious experience. The other operates several layers beneath that, on the level of evolutionary mechanism, largely invisible to the people the mechanism actually shaped. That gap between mechanism and meaning is, in the end, the entire reason this particular behavior is worth this much attention in the first place. It is not an obscure or trivial habit. It is one of the only behaviors on Earth that is close to universal across every known human culture, and yet almost never discussed, examined, or questioned by the overwhelming majority of the roughly 8 billion people who quietly practice some version of it. It hides in plain sight, doing exactly what it evolved to do, concealing not only the specific act itself, but for the vast majority of human history, concealing the very reason for its own existence as well. Think about how many other behaviors this entire investigation has quietly touched without ever naming them directly as part of the same system. The instinct that makes a couple lower their voices in a shared apartment. The instinct that makes a teenager, without ever being taught the specific rule, understand exactly which doors in a house are supposed to stay closed and which ones are not. The instinct behind a locked hotel room door that no one consciously thinks about twice, because it feels less like a decision and more like a background fact of how privacy simply works. None of that required a lecture on paternity confidence or evolutionary biology to install. It arrived preloaded, the same way a fear of falling arrives preloaded, the same way an instinct to flinch from sudden movement in peripheral vision arrives preloaded, not learned once and remembered, but built in from the start, running underneath conscious thought rather than through it. And that is, in its own way, the most unsettling implication sitting underneath everything covered so far. Most people assume they know exactly why they do the things they do, especially the intimate things, the things that feel most personal and most freely chosen. But an instinct this deep, this consistent, this independent of religion, law, geography, and technology was clearly not chosen freely by anyone currently alive to practice it. It was inherited, whole, from ancestors who never once explained themselves, because there was no language yet available for them to do so. The reasoning came later. Much later, bolted on afterward by cultures scrambling to explain a behavior that had already been running quietly in the background for a very long time before anyone thought to ask why. Return, for a moment, to that Arabian babbler, since it's the one thread in all of this that ties the entire argument together in a single image. A small, unremarkable desert bird with a brain and a social structure worlds apart from any humans arrived independently through its own separate evolutionary path at the exact same behavioral solution modern humans still use every single day, almost without ever thinking about it. Two species, entirely unrelated, unconnected by ancestry across the whole animal kingdom, both quietly deciding, through nothing more than the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of natural selection, working slowly across enormous stretches of time, that some information, specifically the information about exactly when and with whom reproduction is happening, is safer kept out of view. Not because it is shameful, because it is valuable enough. Across two wildly different evolutionary paths on two wildly different branches of the animal kingdom, for concealment itself to have been worth evolving. Twice, independently, for entirely separate reasons that somehow ended up looking almost exactly the same from the outside. The bedroom door, then, might be one of the oldest instincts anyone alive today carries around without a second thought. Older, quite possibly, than language, older than agriculture, older than any named religion currently practiced anywhere on Earth. Not a wall built for shame. A wall built deep in the evolutionary past to protect a piece of information every single ancestor in that unbroken chain, going back millions of years, needed protected in order for their genetic line to survive intact at all. And that, in the end, might be the real reason the door still closes.